You have found what lights you up. I'm your host, Sunny the Life Coach, and I'm here because I see you searching for something or someone out there to help you feel better. Something to take away the pain that you're feeling, the inadequacies. I know all of the things that happen in life can leave you feeling empty. Your search is over. This podcast is all about finding your own freedom and power to love yourself enough to shine in the ways you were always meant to, the ways in which you are already fully capable of. If you're ready for some real talk, some serious truth bombs, and a few F-bombs, you are in the right place. Let's do this. Let's get lit. Hey now, welcome to episode 34. Channeling my feminine Howard Stern for you all today. I have to say I was a bit sad to have to let go of our Sirius radio subscription a few months back, but honestly, it was one of those things we had to reevaluate. Like many others out there in the non-essential or work from home space, my husband and I have barely driven anywhere for the majority of this year. And while Sirius has an app where you can listen to live broadcasts or replays of Howard Stern, if he's your jam, he's absolutely mine, I really wasn't using that feature. For me, Stern is best listened to during a long commute. It really makes the time go by while I'm learning things about other people in this world. I would get into this zone during his interviews, and I found myself really drawn to celebrities that I hadn't considered I would ever identify with. Lady Gaga was a big one for me. I just had this realization, like a slap in the face, listening to her talk, that she wasn't that different than me as a person. Now, as a performer, she is certainly larger than life. Quite honestly, I wasn't that drawn to her music before. I thought of it as kind of manufactured bubblegum pop, even though I knew that she had some deep messages in her lyrics of diversity and inclusion, all of those things. I just used to think, well, I'm not crazy about that electric beat. I don't get the draw. Until one morning, several years ago, when we were still living in Kentucky, I was driving to work and I heard her sing Edge of Glory live on the Howard Stern Show. It moved me to tears. I literally had to pull over and have a few moments to compose myself because I had been listening to her tell a story about her grandfather and how his death led her to write that song. It was just Lady Gaga and her piano, and it was slow and melodic, so very powerful. A way I'd never heard it performed before. And combined with her story, it just took on an entirely different meaning from that point forward. I have a level of respect and admiration that I didn't know was possible. I was blown away. That experience changed my story about her, who she was as a person as well as a performer, and I just have the highest level of admiration for her now. Same with Stern. If you had told my younger self that I would be into Howard Stern later in life, I would have laughed because I thought he was just the shock jock, raunchy and exploitive of women. When I actually gave him a chance, I completely altered my opinion, and it wasn't hard to do because he's an absolute master interviewer, getting people to open up on levels I've never heard elsewhere. Yes, there's still some raunchiness, but I can look past that. It's just silliness, really. That's what I think of it as now. I just love the interviews and the unplugged musical performances. So good. By the way, you can find those performances on YouTube. Just search Stern Gaga as keywords and you'll get a bunch of treats. You're welcome. Anyway, I channeled Howard Stern for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm going to talk about the stories we tell ourselves today. And of course, one of my stories was that Stern and Gaga weren't my kind of people, which turned out to be a complete lie. Secondly, my husband just got a new lease vehicle a few weeks ago, and we now have Sirius back, at least for a trial period of, I think, a few months. So I'm loving getting little clips of what I've been missing when we drive to hockey practice and to games twice per week, which is about the only time I get to hear it, but it's still something. That's super fun. That's what made me think of Stern today. Now, let's talk about our stories. And I don't mean the stories we form about other people as much as I mean the stories that we form about ourselves, because that's what it really comes down to. Other people will do what they do, they will say what they say, they will be who they are. It's the meaning that you assign to yourself about your interactions and experiences that really matters. And a lot of times we come out of a particular life experience feeling like a victim. It isn't fair that this thing happened to me. It's an injustice. It's wrong on so many levels. Perhaps that is true. Perhaps that is your story. Let me tell you a little thing about truth. I think it's all up to interpretation. Something that might be more evident to some of you in this day and age. Even when I've referenced Byron Katie's work, where you should always ask yourself if that thought in your head is true, even doing that earns you a follow-up question should your answer be yes. And that follow-up question is, how do I know it's true? For me, that's where we can separate fact from opinion. Facts are not truth. Your truth comes from your stories. Facts are indisputable. They really go hand in hand with circumstances because facts are neutral. Everyone would agree. If they aren't trying to manipulate you, there is no such thing as an alternative fact, just as there is no such thing as an alternative law of gravity. Earth has a gravitational pull. Fact. When objects fall, they fall to the earth. Fact. There's no room for opinion here. What I really want you to start considering is the difference between fact and truth in your stories. Because there's a little gray area there sometimes. We think they're the same, but they aren't. Think about it. Even when you take the witness stand in a courtroom and you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God, what you're really swearing to is that you will give your best interpretation of the truth. You will relay what you saw or heard of the crime in question through your lens, through your filters. Now, if another witness comes up who was standing on the other side of the street and was closer to the scene, and that witness has 20/20 vision while you weren't wearing your contacts at the time, does that make the other witness wrong or untruthful? Not at all. That's why witness testimony can be so problematic. Truth is interpretation. Facts are indisputable. Okay, enough with the courtroom analogy. Allow me to indulge in sports for a moment. I need to do this. The Pittsburgh Steelers are now 9-0. Whoa! They remain undefeated. Fact. There is no arguing with the scoreboard or the final outcome of each game that has gotten my favorite team to this point of the season. I am loving it. Now, if I think the primary reason they are on this winning streak is that the defense has, at the time of this recording, gone 66 straight games with a sack. 66 straight games, you all. And my husband thinks the primary reason is their outstanding wide receivers. Which one is true? Well, technically both are true. We each have our interpretation of the fact, which is that the Steelers are undefeated. Fucking fact. And I'm totally okay with them losing a game or two before playoffs. On that, he and I can agree. Right now, I'm just truly enjoying this because it's a highlight of 2020 and I am here for it. Thank you for allowing my momentary indulgence. It's so fun being a Steelers fan in Cowboys land. I wear my swag everywhere and I do not care. This has been a warm-up of analogies. It's time for a little story that I interpreted about me being a victim of circumstance, a victim of fact. So much so that I was ready to publicly call out big government on social media over the course of several weeks. I was that angry. Oh, and I was determined to get as many people as possible to agree with me because I still think it was bullshit on some level. I do. That's part of my story that I'm not quite willing to let go of just yet. If you have heard my very first episode, you know that I wasn't born in a hospital, but I was born at home. Side note here. It's so wild, you all. I recently listened back to my first episode, which was just over 6 months ago, and it wasn't the best audio because I was still learning the tech and the right place to be in the house. And you know what, though? I'm still happy with the content. I think that part is solid. I'm not going to replace it. I think it'll be fun to continue to look back on later and see the growth over time, just like listening to Howard Stern replays from decades ago sounds so much different. Anyway, thank you to all who have been here from the beginning and got past the first few episodes and still kept coming back. Thank you. If you haven't heard episode 1, my story around my home birth was one where I later found myself feeling ashamed to have not been born in a hospital like everyone else in this first world country. I have yet to meet another human who entered the world like I did. Isn't that crazy? Even my parents were born in hospitals. But they were living the hippie dream at the time and, ironically enough, were very anti-establishment. This is going to matter a whole hell of a lot here in a few minutes. They were determined to have their baby on their terms. No one was going to tell them what to do or how to do it. Love their hearts. Obviously, that all turned out okay because, hello, here I am. And I've always been healthy and never healthier than now, as a matter of fact. As I think I've said before, my parents only stayed together for a couple of years. They split up when I was a toddler. That's not what this story is about, but it's important to mention because my stepfather later adopted me. And my birth certificate was changed because that's how adoption works. Your name at birth is altered to the new name. They seal the original, and I don't even know what it takes to get an original birth certificate unsealed or how it even works, but I came close to having to find out. Oh yeah, this is a fun little saga to recap. Then in my 20s, I went through a bit of an identity crisis and filed a court order to change my name back to my birth name. And that is the name that's on my marriage certificate, my birth name. Because with a small filing fee and paperwork, you can change your name to whatever you want, no questions asked. Fun times. You following me so far? A few years ago, my husband and I decided that we would take our first trip overseas. We planned to go to several parts of Europe over the span of about 10 days, and the trip was booked to happen over the summer. So around February of that year, we all went to get passports. Well, I'd never had a passport because I had never traveled outside of the country. And my husband warned me to take my fat folder of paperwork that traces all of my name changes with me. Because let me tell you, it was ugly trying to get a driver's license when we moved to Texas. Getting my license in Texas was ugly for me because the name on my birth certificate didn't match the name on my marriage certificate. Oh, of course, I had to have both documents in addition to my out-of-state license, and everything needed to match perfectly because bureaucracy. That was my experience for my license. It took several trips and hours of angst, so I was armed with all of my paperwork for my trip to the passport office. And I was also fully armed in my victimhood. I just knew there were going to be problems. And everything seemed to go smoothly enough that day. A couple of weeks later, the guys received their passports in the mail, and I received a letter denying my application. The reason? I didn't have a birth certificate until several years after my birth. So I needed to provide proof of when I was born. It wasn't any of the name changes. And nothing in that stack of official documents that I had was going to help me fix the fact that my parents didn't create a birth certificate for me until I was a few years old. They didn't think it was important to file papers with the government back in the day. They only did it later when they had to. Remember, I told you that anti-establishment attitude of a couple of 20-something hippies that was going to come into play? Well, here we are. And the things I'm telling you about what my parents did back in the day are actually what they relayed to me while I was going through this drama. Well, we just didn't think it was that important. They certainly didn't consider in that moment that it would impact all of us decades later. So here we are. The fact is, my parents did not register my birth. Simple as that. One of those things that would have automatically been done at a hospital. Fact is, the U.S. Department of State was not going to issue a passport until I had further proof of my birth. I think it's important to note here that the only options for proof of birth when a certificate is delayed more than a year, as was my case, are one of the following: a baptism certificate, a U.S. Census record, early school records, family Bible record, or a birth affidavit. Well, I had none of that, and I came to hold the opinion over the next couple of months of drama and back and forth with the U.S. Department of State, a lot of phone calls, sworn affidavits from both of my parents that I was indeed born when they said I was, and that they were the only witnesses, that I was a victim. I started to feel frustrated, hopeless, and angry that I was being put through this. I had been employed since I was 15 years old, paid taxes into the system my entire life, and now my very existence was being questioned. I had to prove that I was born. That was the story that I was telling myself, and it may be obvious that I very quickly took on that victim role. Now, this episode will go on for 3 times the normal length if I relay all of the things that I tried along the way, so I will spare you any further details. I will admit, though, that at one point I got so pissed off about all of it that I started posting publicly on Facebook and eventually tagging the U.S. Department of State with almost daily updates with the hashtag #IamLegit. I was going through it. And if you have followed my personal Facebook page from the days before I became a coach, you know the whole story. And it was almost comical at times. I was posting dated baby pictures of me walking around in the woods, probably before I even had a birth certificate. The audacity. I was posting my kindergarten report card as evidence of my early school records. All the things. I got really snarky about it at times. I just couldn't help myself. Full-blown victim of government bureaucracy with a healthy dose of patriarchy thrown in for good measure. Because only men would come up with such a dumbass list of qualifications for proof of birth. A family Bible? Really? Give me a break. So I'll just wrap the story with this. It was my first census record that was finally accepted. I mean, I was maybe 8 years old by that time, so I'm still a little baffled as to why that was an acceptable document of early childhood, but it's done. I got the damn passport, and I really felt that I had to fight hard for it. Yes, we went on our trip, and yes, we had amazing experiences. I find it crazy, too, that even just in recapping that experience, I felt myself falling back into victimhood just a little bit. Wild. My mind just went back to those thoughts I was having at the time. It isn't fair that I have to jump through all of these hoops. It's not my fault where I was born or what my parents did or didn't do afterward. I shouldn't have to deal with this. No one else on the planet has ever had to deal with this. I mean, listen to that. It isn't fair. It's not my fault. Why me? I mean, no one else on the planet? Seriously. I'm aware there have been far worse atrocities than my mountain of inconvenience I had through no fault of my own. And the fact that a list of acceptable documents exists means obviously others have had to go through something like this. I simply haven't been able to find anyone in my generation, but still. It was my truth according to my story, and this isn't a comparison of anyone else's hardships. Let me make that perfectly clear. I'm sharing only to illustrate a pretty darn good example, if I might say so, of falling into the victim role. And I lived there in that role for a solid 8 to 10 weeks, I believe, in victimhood. Let me tell you, it does not feel empowering in the least. That's really what I'm getting at here. It's all about empowerment. Changing the things that are in your control and having the wisdom to know when it's not in your control. When you have created a story around your role as the victim, it might make for a good movie script. Well, this one isn't too terribly exciting, but you know what I mean. Your story might make for a good movie script, but until Hollywood calls, you have to live with what's in your head. Are you enjoying that highlight reel? How is that movie of yours? You may have a story in which you play the victim role because you believe it's a legitimate part of your identity. Perhaps you have a much more devastating story than I do. Maybe you were molested, assaulted, or otherwise abused, harmed in such a way that a good chunk of humanity would agree that it was unfair and that you didn't deserve that. I'm not going to tell you to simply change your thoughts around any harm that was done to you. However, I will ask you why you want to keep identifying as a victim. That's not a life sentence unless you decide that it is. Whatever has happened to you in the past does not have to define your present or your future. Or maybe it does, only in a different way than you've been viewing it. Maybe instead of identifying as a victim, you identify as a survivor, because words matter. The way that you use words to tell your story and to ultimately form your identity matters. Maybe you start reaching out to others who have had similar experiences, and you're reaching out as a survivor and a healer instead of a victim who is broken. Maybe you put exponentially more of what's good into the world as a result of the bad things that happen to you. That's always an option that is available to you if you are willing to rewrite your story. That would be an extreme example, but there are humans walking among us today who have demonstrated that it's possible. Think of Elizabeth Smart, who was kidnapped from her Utah bedroom at age 14, parents' worst nightmare, and held captive for 9 months. Google her name, and the title that comes with her is American Activist. Think of Malala Yousafzai, Pakistani activist and the youngest Nobel laureate. She's the one who was shot in the head in attempted assassination by the Pakistani Taliban as a young girl for advocating education in a country that denied women and girls the right to do so. Think of Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, who had been chained, tortured, and abused for a decade in Cleveland after they were kidnapped from the street at different intervals, sometimes while walking home from school. All three of them are certainly viewed as survivors, and while they are each giving back in different ways as they continue to work through healing their own traumas, they are all involved in some capacity toward helping others. Just some examples of other humans who have lived through some horrible shit and who are working to flip the script about who they are. They can't change what happened. They don't even have to look at that period of their life any differently than it was a horrible thing. What they don't do is identify as victims. They identify as survivors. And no matter how awful their experiences may have been, They are now making the choice not to live solely in that experience, but rather to rewrite their stories. And our brains love a good story. And by good in this sense, I mean full of drama. When we have a terrible experience, our thoughts will replay that scene of our movie over and over for us, and we may start dwelling in a dark place with no good outcome. What is your victim story? And likely it's somewhere between these extremes I've given you so far. For most of you, that would be your truth. But seriously, I want you to find what it is. I'm sure you already know, because you do keep replaying it and thinking about how it's not fair and you didn't deserve that thing to happen to you. The facts will not change. The circumstances will always stay the same. It's how you shape your thoughts around what that means to you now and what it will mean to you in the future that will go into your new script. How you tell your story going forward. How you shape it into something that helps you evolve to your highest potential instead of keeping you stuck in the past. Even the small things that seem like a big fucking deal at the time, like my temporary inability to get a passport. Acknowledge what it is that has you all twisted up and find a new way to tell that story. For me, my passport story definitely became a learning experience. It was a hard lesson in ages-old bureaucracy that may have worked against me for a moment in time, but I was able to eventually get over the hurdles that were placed in front of me at every turn. This can be about determination, perseverance, and persistence. And while I may have sounded off on social media just a bit, I honestly did keep my cool with every person that I spoke with on the phone, at the notary, over multiple trips to the post office, all of the people and all of the places. So those parts become more of my story now than the shitty annoyances of having to go through that in the first place. I also opened my eyes even further to my privilege. That story helped me to do so, not just the color of my skin, although I am very aware of this, or the knowledge that this particular story is far from oppressive given our country's dark history, or the full awareness that challenges in a first world country don't include those everyday advantages that we sometimes take for granted as women. The ability to receive an education, drive a car, vote in an election. This isn't meant to be a comparison in any way, simply an illustration of one point in time that I personally created a victim story. We tend to do that when challenges seem bigger than we can overcome, when we feel powerless, helpless, and hopeless to step toward any semblance of progress or healing. No matter how big or small that challenge may seem in comparison to the rest of the world. My recognition of privilege, and it's also an honor, also lies in the fact that I still have both of my parents to call and ask questions and find out even more of the most interesting parts of the story, of the overall story of how I came to be here. Because yes, all three of us had to take some trips down memory lane through the process. And it turns out that we might not have otherwise had those conversations. And I don't know how much longer I'll have them around and be able to talk to them whenever I need to. There's that heightened awareness that everything happens the way it's supposed to. As Rumi says, everything about yesterday has gone with yesterday. Today, it is needed to say new things. That is now my truth. And to be clear, it hasn't always been. I acknowledge that I have lived in my past, allowing myself to be defined by my stories, moving away from that and toward the concept of saying new things about myself and how my life has unfolded up to this point has been a game changer. And you can do it too. Find a story from your past that is in need of a rewrite. One where you come out as the survivor, the victor, or even a little bit more enlightened. I'm not talking about Buddha level enlightenment, but simply finding some light in those shadows within you. Trust me, it makes all the difference, not only in how you see yourself, but in how you see others, and how we all get to navigate in this world, this life, together. You get to keep the part of your story that is fact, just that one thing. Find a new truth about it, though. Create a new outcome from it. And don't forget to enjoy the process of creating something new about yourself and for yourself. If you would like to dive further into areas of the movie that is your life in which you have cast yourself in the role of victim, head over to sunnythelifecoach.com. Click Let's Do This, and let's schedule a time to talk through it. Yes, let's do that. And light up. Shine on.